Racist judge sentences innocent black youth. 5 years later, his daughter paid the price. The courtroom was ice cold, not from the air conditioning, but from the tension that coiled in every corner like a predator waiting to strike. The walls, a dull beige, seemed to close in tighter with every breath. 17-year-old Jalen Carter stood at the defendant's table, hands clenched at his sides, wearing a borrowed navy blazer that hung awkwardly on his lean frame. His mother, Melanie Carter, sat behind him, her fingers white-knuckled around a rosary she hadn't touched in years. They had walked in believing in truth, in the system, in justice. But justice wasn't present today. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Every person in the room stood as Judge Douglas Weller entered, his black robe billowing behind him like a storm cloud. His face was carved from stone, expressionless, unyielding. He didn't look at Jalen. He never had. Jalen's public defender, Mr. Alvarez, adjusted his glasses nervously as the clerk read the charge. One count of felony theft in the amount of $480.42 from Macklin's Electronics on the night of September 2nd. A ripple of disbelief moved through the gallery. Those who knew Jalen, his teachers, classmates, even his church pastor, knew he couldn't have done it. Not Jalen, not the straight-A student who tutored younger kids after school and spent weekends volunteering at the food bank. Not the boy who had been working his shift at the public library at the exact time the alleged theft occurred. But the judge's eyes were already glazed, uninterested. Evidence? Irrelevant. Truth? Inconvenient. Mr. Alvarez stood, voice clear, confident. "Your Honor, we have security footage from the library, timestamped 7:04 p.m. It clearly shows Jalen Carter checking in at the front desk and shelving books until 9 p.m. when the theft allegedly occurred. That's 2 solid hours of confirmed alibi." Judge Weller didn't flinch. Alvarez continued. "In addition, we have 4 witnesses who placed him there. His supervisor, 2 patrons, and the assistant librarian. All have submitted sworn affidavits. Further, the suspect caught on camera at the store was shorter, heavier, and wore a jacket with a school logo from a different district. The video played on a small monitor to the side. Grainy, but clear enough. The thief in the footage moved with a hunched posture. Jalen, standing tall and slender, barely resembled the figure. The room waited for a reaction from the bench. Nothing. Then came Judge Weller's voice, measured, slow, and dripping with disdain. "Mr. Alvarez, I've heard your client's glowing resume, but I've seen many young men with bright futures believe they're above the law. We are not here to discuss his community service. We are here to discuss the law he broke." Melanie's heart stopped. She stared at the judge wide-eyed. "He didn't break the law," she whispered, her voice strangled by panic. The gavel cracked down like a gunshot. "Order in the court." Jalen turned slightly, looking back at his mother. His eyes said everything. "I didn't do this. I swear." And Melanie, through the tears welling in her eyes, nodded. "I know, baby, I know." The prosecution, emboldened by the judge's apathy, smirked as they delivered their closing. "This is about deterrence, about showing our youth there are consequences for poor decisions." Poor decisions. Jalen's only decision had been clocking in on time at a library shift he never missed. The only thing he was guilty of was being a black teenager in the wrong courtroom. When Judge Weller rose to deliver the verdict, the courtroom felt like it had been placed underwater. Every breath was a battle. Every heartbeat pounded in everyone's ears like a war drum. "Jalen Carter," the judge began, peering over the rim of his glasses. "In light of the evidence presented, though some may find it compelling, this court finds you guilty of theft." Gasps erupted like gunfire. Melanie stood, hands trembling. "No! No, this is wrong! Look at the footage again!" 2 officers stepped forward, gently guiding her back down. Tears streamed down her face, but her voice remained sharp. "My son was at the library. You're destroying his life. Please!" Judge Weller banged his gavel again. "Enough!" Jalen didn't move. He couldn't. The words hadn't sunk in yet. "This court hereby sentences you to 2 years in juvenile correctional facility. Sentence begins immediately." It was like the floor disappeared beneath Jalen's feet. His mouth opened. but no sound came. His legs buckled slightly. Melanie rushed forward before the officer stopped her. "Jalen!" she cried. "No, you can't take him!" "I love you, Mom," he choked as the bailiffs handcuffed him. The courtroom descended into chaos. Melanie's scream echoed long after she was removed from the courtroom. The pastor tried to reason with the judge. The librarian shouted, "He was with me all night." But it didn't matter. No one heard them. No one wanted to. As Jalen was led down the hallway, the camera footage still looped silently on the courtroom screen, showing a thief who clearly wasn't him. The system had chosen blindness, and the price would be paid not just by Jalen, but by everyone who believed in the myth of justice that day. Because on that cold, heartless morning, the truth had been buried beneath a robe and a gavel. The rise of a mother on fire, Melanie's hunt for justice. Melanie Carter had never imagined her kitchen table would one day become a war room. Where there were once cereal boxes and school permission slips, now lay towers of legal documents, court transcripts, printouts of sentencing records, and half-empty coffee mugs strewn across stained notepads. The glow of her laptop never faded. It became her new sun, and her sleepless eyes had become used to its artificial light. The ticking of the clock above her sink wasn't comforting anymore. It was a countdown to how long her son, Jalen Carter, would remain behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. She'd been a school teacher for 12 years, a woman of order, schedules, and simple routines. But the day Judge Douglas Weller slammed his gavel and stole her son's future, something inside Melanie snapped, and something far more dangerous awakened. She wasn't just a grieving mother anymore. She was a woman on fire. Melanie began with the obvious, Jalen's case file. She reread it 100 times, memorized the sequence of events, highlighted every inconsistency. But it wasn't enough to prove her son's innocence. She needed to prove a pattern, something deeper, something systematic. So she turned her focus to the man in the black robe who had sat so smugly on that bench, Judge Weller. She filed a Freedom of Information request, pretending to be a curious law student. She contacted retired clerks, found old court calendars, dug into every database she could hack her way into. And when the first box of records arrived from the courthouse archive, she didn't flinch. She pulled out the first file, opened a new spreadsheet, and began entering sentencing data, case after case, year after year. It didn't take long before the pattern emerged like blood in water. Black defendant, harsh sentence. White defendant, probation. 2 men, same charge, same age. 1 black, 1 white. The white defendant got community service. The black man, 18 months in county jail. It wasn't an outlier, it was a blueprint. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through her data late one night. Her spreadsheet now had over 200 cases spanning a decade, each line a story of ruined futures and stolen dignity. She ran a formula, calculating the average sentence length by race. Her screen froze for a second as the result loaded. Black defendants received sentences 63% longer than white defendants under Judge Weller. Melanie gasped, not from surprise, she had already suspected as much, but from the weight of confirmation. This wasn't just about her son anymore. This was a systemic betrayal, orchestrated by a man the community had trusted for over 20 years. And she was going to expose it all. The next day she skipped work, printed every chart, every table, and taped them across her walls like a detective chasing a serial killer. Her living room became a crime lab, every corner marked by legal pads, sticky notes, and color-coded binders. This wasn't grief. This was battle preparation. Her phone buzzed. Another parent reaching out. Their son had also been sentenced harshly by Weller for a petty offense. Then another call, and another. Word was spreading that Melanie Carter was digging deep, and the community, once afraid, was now cautiously curious. A local librarian named Mrs. Palmer knocked on her door, trembling with a manila folder in hand. "I thought this might help," she whispered. Inside were newspaper clippings, stories of white teenagers caught shoplifting or driving under the influence, who walked free after appearing before Judge Weller. Their names, families, connections. Many had ties to city council members, law enforcement, even local donors. Melanie pinned them to the wall. "This man has been protecting his kind and punishing ours for years," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. She began cross-referencing the judge's golf outings, campaign donors, and private affiliations. The web became messier, but the narrative clearer. This wasn't just negligence. It was a quiet, calculated machine. And Melanie wasn't scared anymore. She bought a whiteboard the size of a refrigerator, wrote "Truth is the target" across the top in red marker, and mapped every detail. Names, sentences, zip codes, victim race, defendant race, outcomes. She began connecting the dots like a seasoned federal investigator. Her sister dropped by one afternoon and stopped cold in the doorway. "Mel, are you okay?" Melanie didn't answer. She pointed at the wall. "I'm building a case stronger than anything that courtroom has ever seen." Her sister stared in silence, then finally said, "You're not just fighting for Jalen anymore, are you?" "No," Melanie replied coldly. "I'm fighting for every black kid that man's ever buried in paperwork and forgot." But as her mission grew, so did the threats. One morning she found a note taped to her windshield. "Stop digging, or your son won't be the only one behind bars." Her hands clenched the note, but her spine stayed straight. She didn't report it. She taped it next to her data on the wall. Fuel for the fire. She began organizing community meetings, presenting her findings like a lawyer in court. Her voice grew sharper, more commanding. She learned to speak in terms the system respected. Statistics, precedents, ratios. The mother who once trembled when asking a school principal for a meeting now grilled city officials on judicial accountability in front of news cameras. And the media took notice. Local reporters came to interview her. Then state news. Then national outlets sent emails requesting documents. She started uploading her findings online under the name Justice Mom Truths. The post went viral. By now, Judge Weller's office knew who she was, but she didn't care. She sat in her living room, the flicker of TV news bouncing off walls covered in charts and headlines. Her phone buzzed again. Another parent thanking her, another case number forwarded for review. She looked up at the ceiling and whispered, "I'm not done, Jalen. They don't get to do this to you or anyone else." Melanie Carter, once just a single mother from the East Side, had become something else entirely. A symbol, a strategist, a relentless force of truth. She wasn't just fighting back. She was dismantling the system, brick by brick. And she was just getting started. It was a Tuesday night drenched in silence, the kind that pressed down on Melanie Carter's shoulders like an invisible weight. The only sound in the room was the mechanical hum of her laptop and the rhythmic scratching of her pen against yet another page of court data. Her living room, once filled with family dinners and homework sessions, had transformed into a fortress of evidence. Walls lined with charts, coffee cups stacked like sandbags, legal pads bleeding with ink. The war for her son's freedom had become her full-time existence. She was reviewing sentencing patterns for the 100th time when her phone vibrated sharply on the table. Unknown number, no caller ID. Her instincts screamed caution, but she answered. A deep, rushed voice came through the line, distorted as if passed through a filter. "You don't know me, but I know what you're doing, and I've seen the video." Melanie froze. Her heart skipped. "Who is this?" "I can't tell you, but there's a package coming to your door in 20 minutes. No cops, no press. Watch it, then decide if you really want to keep going." The line went dead. 20 minutes later, true to the promise, a small yellow envelope was slid beneath her front door. No label, no return address. Melanie stared at it like it might explode. Her hands were shaking. She brought it into the kitchen, slid a knife through the seal, and pulled out a single USB drive taped to a folded note. The note read, "This is the original. Not what the cops turned in. Ask yourself why." She didn't hesitate. She plugged it into her laptop, praying it wasn't malware, but knowing it wasn't. What appeared on her screen changed everything. It was surveillance footage. Crisp, clear, too clear. The angle was wide, showing the inside of Macklin's Electronics, the store where her son had allegedly committed the theft. The timestamp on the corner read September 2nd, 7:41 p.m. the exact time they said Jalen had stolen electronics from behind the counter. But the figure in the video wasn't her son, not even close. This man was shorter, stockier, and unmistakably white. He wore a red baseball cap pulled low over his face, a dark hoodie with the logo of Jefferson High School, and light-colored jeans. He moved with practiced confidence, not like someone scared or panicking, but like someone who knew the cameras wouldn't matter. Melanie's mouth fell open as the suspect reached behind the register and filled his backpack with Bluetooth speakers and headphones. He even looked up at the camera once, arrogantly, as if daring someone to stop him. The freeze frame captured his face for just a second, but it was enough. Enough for Melanie to know exactly who he was. Tommy Brandt. She hadn't seen him in years, but she remembered that smirk, the smirk that had taunted Jalen back in middle school. The same Tommy whose father, Councilman Richard Brandt, sat on the city planning committee and was well known for his tough-on-crime stance. As long as it wasn't his own kid in the crosshairs. Her stomach churned. Her son had been thrown into a cell, torn from his future, while the real thief walked free because of a name, a network, and a father with friends in high places. Melanie leaned back in her chair, pulse pounding. The implications hit her like a freight train. The grainy, low-resolution footage that the prosecution had submitted in court was a doctored version, deliberately fuzzy, making the thief's identity unrecognizable. Someone had covered for Tommy, someone high up. She stared at the video again, her hands clenched, her jaw locked. They didn't just ignore the truth, they buried it. And they were counting on her to stay buried too. But Melanie Carter didn't know how to stay down. She launched into motion. First, she copied the file, twice. One to her encrypted cloud storage, one onto a second drive for backup. Then she took screenshots, labeled the timeline, and created a side-by-side comparison between the original blurry footage used in court and this new damning evidence. Then she opened Twitter. Her fingers were fire on the keyboard. Breaking. This is the real footage of the Macklin's electronics theft. The boy in this video is not my son, Jalen Carter. My son was in the library at the time, proven by multiple witnesses. The real thief, Tommy Brandt, son of Councilman Richard Brandt. Watch, retweet. She uploaded the video, attached the comparison stills, then she hit post and waited. 10 minutes later, 200 views. 30 minutes later, 12,000. By the end of the first hour, justice for Jalen was trending in 4 states. People were outraged, not just angry, furious. This is corruption in plain sight, one user wrote. If this was my son, I'd burn the courthouse down, said another. Expose them all. Every last one, read the third. The story was spreading like wildfire. News outlets began tagging her. Emails poured in from journalists, advocacy groups, lawyers, civil rights activists offered support. And just as quickly, the pushback began. Her phone rang. Unknown number again. I warned you, the same voice muttered before hanging up. An hour later, her Wi-Fi went out. 2 hours later, a black SUV parked across the street. Didn't leave. But Melanie, she didn't care anymore. She wasn't hiding. She stepped onto her porch, camera in hand, and filmed the car. Uploaded that too. They're watching me, but I'm not afraid. I have the truth. You can't scare me into silence. My son deserves freedom, and you don't get to bury that. The post hit 2 million views by midnight. The next morning, Good Morning America called. By noon, CNN was broadcasting the video. By evening, the district attorney's office had released a statement saying they were reviewing new evidence in the Carter case. But Melanie knew what that really meant. They were scrambling. Jalen called her from the detention center later that night. His voice was tired, small, but for the first time in weeks, it held a spark of hope. I heard about the video, he whispered. People are talking about it in here. The guards are nervous. Melanie laughed through tears. Baby, the world's watching now. We're not alone anymore. Across town, in the mayor's private office, Councilman Brandt slammed his fist against the desk. She was never supposed to get that footage, he barked. Who leaked it? Nobody answered, because it didn't matter anymore. The lie had cracked, and the truth was flooding in. Melanie sat in her living room, surrounded by chaos, papers everywhere, phone buzzing nonstop, laptop overheating. But her eyes were fixed on the TV screen, where her son's name was now being spoken with reverence, not suspicion. The face of the red hat thief appeared beside Councilman Brandt's campaign photo. The hypocrisy was no longer hidden. The dam had burst. And Melanie Carter? She wasn't just a grieving mother anymore. She was a national symbol of what happens when truth meets unshakable determination. And nothing, not a judge, not a politician, not even an entire corrupt system, was going to stop her now. While the city reeled from the shocking footage Melanie released, another storm was quietly brewing, this time from within the judge's own household. It began as a harmless assignment, a term paper for her criminal justice statistics class, nothing more than another requirement on the long, grueling road to her law degree. Isabella Weller, 20 years old, ambitious, top of her class at Halstead Law School, thought it would be an easy topic. Analyze judicial sentencing trends using real court data. She had access, after all. Her father, Judge Douglas Weller, had served on the bench for over 2 decades. Revered, respected, untouchable. At least that's what she used to believe. She sat in the dim light of the law school library, her fingers dancing over the keyboard as she pulled archived sentencing data from the state's public record system. She had expected to find consistency, logic, and a model of fairness, an affirmation of everything her father had taught her about justice growing up. Instead, what she uncovered felt like watching a fault line crack open beneath her feet. At first, the discrepancies were subtle. A few cases here and there, similar crimes, vastly different sentences. But as she went deeper, filtering by race, age, and socioeconomic background, an unmistakable pattern emerged. She double-checked, triple-checked, pulled more records, then cross-referenced with federal sentencing guidelines. And when the final spreadsheet loaded on her screen, she felt like throwing up. Black defendants under her father's jurisdiction had received sentences on average 62% longer than white defendants for the same offenses over the past 10 years. The pattern wasn't an outlier, it was a system built by the man who had once tucked her into bed, whispering stories about integrity and fairness. A system presided over by her father. Isabella stared at the blinking cursor on her laptop, her entire body numb. Her hand slowly moved to the folder labeled Carter Jalen. She clicked it open. A chill ran down her spine. She remembered the case, everyone did. A 17-year-old honor student sentenced to 2 years in juvenile detention despite video evidence and multiple alibis. Her father had barely looked up before slamming the gavel. Her throat tightened. She thought back to the courtroom that day. She had watched from the gallery, confused by her father's cold demeanor. She had chalked it up to protocol, but now she knew the truth. He knew what he was doing. She closed the laptop, sat back in her chair, and stared at the ceiling. Her mind raced, images flashing like lightning strikes. Her father giving interviews about justice reform, shaking hands with city officials, laughing at dinner as if he weren't silently destroying lives from behind the bench. And suddenly, the house she had grown up in didn't feel like home. It felt like a crime scene. That night, Isabella drove home with her heart pounding. She clutched the printed data in her bag like it was radioactive. The Weller home sat behind tall iron gates, warm light glowing through the windows. A portrait of her father hung in the entryway, robed and proud. But as she stepped inside, it seemed to glare at her like a warning. She found him in the study, surrounded by law books, sipping brandy. "Dad," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "I need to talk to you." Judge Weller looked up, smiling. "My little crusader, how's that paper going?" She set the folder down on his desk. "Read it." He raised an eyebrow, opening the pages. The smile slowly faded. He flipped page after page, eyes narrowing as the data punched through his composure like bullets. "What is this?" he muttered. "Your cases," she said. "Your decisions. 10 years worth. The numbers don't lie." He slammed the folder shut. "This is cherry-picked. You don't understand the context." Isabella's voice rose. "I understand exactly what this means. You sent Jalen Carter to detention for 2 years based on a crime he didn't commit. There were witnesses, video evidence. He had an alibi. And he's not the only one. There are dozens more. You're speaking from emotion, not reason, he snapped. The world isn't as black and white as your classroom wants it to be. No, she fired back, eyes burning. But your courtroom is. The air turned electric. Her mother, Patricia, appeared in the doorway, drawn by the shouting. Isabella, what's going on? I found proof, she said, her voice breaking. He's been handing down longer sentences to Black and Latino defendants for years. It's all in there. Patricia looked at her husband, unsure, eyes flickering with fear. Judge Weller stood up, towering. You will not bring this filth into my house. You're my daughter. You owe me respect. I owe the truth more than I owe you, Isabella said coldly. I'm going to report this. You'll destroy me, he growled. She held his gaze. You already destroyed yourself. I'm just refusing to cover it up. His face twisted with something between fury and fear. If you go public with this, don't expect another cent for law school. Don't expect anything from this family. A long silence. Then Isabella slowly picked up her folder and bag. I don't need your money, she whispered. I need to sleep at night. She walked out the front door and didn't look back. 3 days later, her story broke. Isabella sat on the set of a local news station, dressed in a plain black blazer, her hands visibly trembling. The host introduced her as the daughter of a longtime judge, now turned whistleblower. The footage of Jalen Carter played on the monitor beside them. She stared at it, fury and sorrow tightening her chest. We have with us Isabella Weller, the anchor said, law student, advocate, and today one of the most courageous voices in this city's justice system. Isabella, tell us what you found. She took a breath. The data doesn't lie. My father's rulings consistently punish people of color more harshly than white defendants. In dozens of cases, young black men were given excessive sentences for nonviolent crimes, while white defendants with similar records walked free. This wasn't coincidence. It was systemic. It was intentional. And it must be exposed. The interview went viral overnight. The internet exploded. Hashtags erupted, Daughter for Justice Weller, Bias Exposed Justice. For Jalen, some called her a hero. Others called her a traitor. Her law school was flooded with interview requests. Civil rights groups reached out with offers to support her. But there were threats too. Emails, anonymous voicemails. Keep your mouth shut or you'll regret it. She ignored them all. Within 72 hours, she was standing in front of the State Judicial Review Board, testifying under oath. Her documents, data, and personal testimony were entered into official record. Cameras waited outside. Protesters lined the courthouse steps. And for the first time, Judge Douglas Weller's name wasn't spoken with reverence. It was spoken with scrutiny. And Isabella, the daughter who once idolized him, had become the catalyst for his fall. At home that evening, she sat alone in her apartment, the air thick with silence. Her phone buzzed with messages, praise, encouragement, invitations to speak. But all she could think of was the boy in the footage, Jalen Carter, still sitting in a detention center for a crime he didn't commit. She picked up her phone and dialed a journalist who had contacted her earlier in the day. I'm ready to go national, she said. Are you sure? He asked. This could get dangerous. She looked around her tiny apartment, thinking of the home she'd left behind, the man who now saw her as an enemy. I'm already in it, she replied. And if I stop now, then everything I did was for nothing. Jalen deserves better. They all do. The reporter didn't hesitate. Let's make it happen. That night, Isabella sent him the complete file. Every case, every number, every name. The truth laid bare for the world to see. She wasn't doing it for revenge. She wasn't doing it for fame. She was doing it because justice had a price, and she was finally willing to pay it, even if it cost her everything. The video had gone viral. The data was undeniable. The city buzzed with outrage, and protesters lined courthouse steps with signs reading, "Free Jalen now," and "Truth can't be silenced." News anchors debated the scandal nightly. Influencers, attorneys, activists, everyone had picked a side. And for once, it felt like justice might actually break through the cracks. But inside the walls of the courthouse, those cracks were being sealed shut with concrete. Melanie Carter stood in front of the clerk's desk, clutching a thick folder filled with new evidence. the high-resolution footage, sworn affidavits, and the statistical analysis that revealed a decade-long pattern of racial bias. The clerk didn't even meet her eyes as he stamped the top page, "Received." "Now what?" Melanie asked, voice taut. "We'll review it in due time," he said without emotion. Due time. As if her son wasn't sitting behind locked doors for a crime he didn't commit. As if every day didn't chip away at his mind, his future, his belief in a world that claimed to protect the innocent. She stormed out, her heels echoing through the marble hallway like gunshots, fury blazing behind her eyes. 2 days later, the response came. Motion for retrial, denied. The words blinked on her screen like a slap to the face. No explanation, no hearing, no acknowledgement of the new footage, the media firestorm, the public outcry, nothing. Just one word as cold and final as a coffin lid. Melanie collapsed into her chair, the air sucked from her lungs. She had done everything right. Gathered proof, built momentum, dragged the truth into the light. And still the system shrugged, because the system wasn't broken. It was built this way. At the detention center, Jalen sat in the corner of the common room, staring blankly at the TV while a segment about his case played silently in the background. Other boys watched with curiosity. Some patted his back, called him famous, but Jalen didn't smile. He didn't feel famous. He felt forgotten. When his mother visited that weekend, she tried to stay strong, but Jalen saw it in her face. The weariness, the rage, the creeping hopelessness. "They said no," she whispered. He didn't respond, just looked down at his hands, wrists scarred from cold metal cuffs. "It doesn't matter," he said flatly. "Yes, it does," she snapped, grabbing his hand. "You matter. They're scared, Jalen. That's why they're stonewalling us, because they know we're right." Jalen stared at her, something flickering in his eyes. Not hope, not yet, but fire. Melanie left that day knowing one thing for certain: they had declared war on truth, and she was done asking for permission to fight back. The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. The phone rang at 2:13 a.m. Melanie Carter jolted upright in bed, heart pounding. The room was pitch black, her breath visible in the cold air. She fumbled for the phone on her nightstand, blinking at the unknown number on the screen. Her instincts screamed, "Don't answer," but her heart, wired to every movement of her son's case, wouldn't allow silence. "Hello?" Her voice cracked from sleep and fear. A pause, then a low, distorted voice crawled through the receiver like venom. "You think you're helping your boy, but if you don't back off, you're going to lose more than just your sleep. Accidents happen, files go missing. People do too." Click. The dial tone screamed in her ear. She sat frozen for several seconds, the phone trembling in her hand. Then, without thinking, she bolted out of bed, grabbed a notepad and scribbled down the time, the voice, the threat. Her mind raced, adrenaline pumping. This wasn't just intimidation. This was a warning. They were watching her, tracking her. They knew she was getting too close, and they were willing to silence her, by any means necessary. The next morning, she tried to file a report with the local police. The officer at the desk didn't even take out a pen. "Do you have the number?" he asked with a smirk. "No," she snapped. "It was blocked." He shrugged. "Then there's nothing we can do. Could have been a prank." "It wasn't a goddamn prank," she hissed. "My son is sitting in juvie for a crime he didn't commit, and someone just threatened my life." The officer leaned back, unconcerned. "Then maybe you should stop stirring things up." Melanie stared at him, rage boiling under her skin. That was the moment she realized. The police weren't going to help. They were part of the system protecting the lie. That same afternoon, she learned that Jalen had been placed in solitary confinement. Administrative separation, they called it. No explanation, no warning, just a 2-sentence update buried in a weekly status report. Her hands shook as she read the line. "Inmate Carter transferred to restricted housing pending review." She called the detention center, demanded answers. The woman on the phone was cold, robotic. It's for his safety, she said. From what? Melanie demanded. We're not authorized to discuss that. Her knees buckled as she hung up. She sat on the kitchen floor, surrounded by court documents and case files, trying not to scream. Her son, the boy who'd never been in trouble a day in his life, was now locked in a concrete box with no contact, no light, and no explanation. And no one cared. Desperate, she contacted attorney Gene Bradshaw, a high-powered civil rights lawyer with a reputation for going after dirty judges. He'd once taken on the police union in a corruption case and won. If anyone could shake the foundation of this case, it was him. She met him at a sleek office in the city, her folder of evidence clutched to her chest like a life vest. Bradshaw skimmed through the documents, his brow furrowed with growing concern. This is solid, he said finally. Really solid. So you'll take the case? He hesitated, sat back. The temperature in the room dropped. Mrs. Carter, he said slowly, you need to understand something. Judge Weller isn't just any judge. He plays golf with 3 members of the ethics board. His brother-in-law sits on the state bar committee. His daughter may have exposed him, but his friends still protect him. She narrowed her eyes. What are you saying? I'm saying, he exhaled, if I take this case, I won't just be going up against a broken system. I'll be going up against a political machine. And I've got 2 daughters, a law firm, and about 5 clients already warning me to stay away from this mess. You're scared, she said, almost in disbelief. I'm cautious, he replied. You should be too. So you're turning me down? I'm telling you to be careful. You're fighting something bigger than you can see. And if you're not prepared to lose everything, your job, your home, maybe your life, then you need to walk away now. Melanie stood, her chair scraping back like thunder. She stared at him with the kind of fury only a mother could possess. My son is already losing everything, she said through clenched teeth. So what the hell do I have left to lose? She left the office without another word. But when she reached the street, the strength began to crack. Her legs felt heavy, her throat tight. The tears came fast, hot, and relentless. She wandered the streets like a ghost, past strangers, traffic, storefronts glowing with holiday lights, a world that kept spinning while hers was crumbling. Back home, she collapsed on the couch, unable to move, her body numb, her mind exhausted. The evidence, the protests, the headlines, none of it mattered anymore. Not to the judge, not to the courts, not to the so-called protectors of justice. The machine was swallowing her, grinding her down with bureaucracy and indifference. And now, her son was alone, locked in a room, cold and isolated, because his mother had fought too hard. She stared at the ceiling, her chest hollow. For the first time since this nightmare began, Melanie Carter felt like giving up. She stopped answering calls. Let the laundry pile up. Forgot to eat. Everywhere she looked, there were reminders of Jalen. The science fair medals, the basketball trophy, the framed honor roll certificate. All of them now felt like taunts from a past life. A life that had been ripped away the moment Judge Weller dropped that gavel. She couldn't sleep. When she did, she dreamed of her son pounding on the walls of solitary, screaming for help no one could hear. One morning after 3 sleepless nights, she stood in the shower, water running ice cold, and whispered, I can't do this anymore. And for a moment she believed it. For a moment the idea of silence felt merciful, of disappearing, letting the world continue its twisted dance without her in it. Maybe then they'd leave Jalen alone. Maybe the system would forget him, and that would somehow be safer. She slid down the tiled wall, water pouring over her as she sat curled beneath the faucet, sobbing like a woman whose soul had been set on fire and left to burn alone. But somewhere, beneath the grief, beneath the fear, there was a spark, a tiny ember refusing to go out. Jalen's voice echoed in her memory. You matter, Mom. You never stop fighting. That's who you are. And she remembered his face the last time she saw him, hollow-eyed but still trying to be brave, still clinging to her strength like a lifeline. That spark caught. Melanie took a deep breath and opened her eyes. Not today, not yet. They hadn't won, and as long as she had breath, they never would. Isabella Weller sat alone in her apartment, the glow of her laptop screen casting long shadows across her face. Sleep had become a stranger, unwelcome, unnecessary. Her inbox was overflowing with messages. Journalists, lawyers, students, strangers. People who had read her statement, seen her interviews, or stumbled across the massive spreadsheet she'd released, documenting her father's biased sentencing record. Each message carried pain. Each one carried a name. Each one begged for help. But there were too many stories for one person to carry. So she picked up her phone and called in reinforcements. The first call went to the Equal Justice Foundation, a nonprofit known for exposing racial injustice in the courts. The woman who answered, Monica Graves, recognized Isabella immediately. "We've been following your story," Monica said, "and your courage." "I need more than recognition," Isabella replied, voice steady despite the weight behind it. "I need a platform, a loud one." "You've got it," Monica said without hesitation. Within 24 hours, Isabella was sitting in a secure Zoom call with a team of attorneys, analysts, and policy experts. She sent them everything, every file, every case, every name she had uncovered in her investigation. When the call ended, one of the lawyers whispered, "This isn't just damning, it's systemic." The second call was riskier, but necessary. The New York Ledger, national coverage, massive reach. She contacted their senior justice correspondent, Alan Reyes, a man with a reputation for going after giants and never blinking. He didn't blink now. "We're going to break this wide open," Alan said, "if you're ready for what's coming." "I've already lost my father," Isabella replied. "What else is there to lose?" Alan worked fast. By the end of the week, a 6-part investigative series dropped on the Ledger's homepage with the headline, "The Black Robe Bias, One Judge, Decades of Injustice." The article hit like a bomb. The first installment followed the story of Jalen Carter, from honor roll student to wrongful imprisonment. It featured interviews with Melanie, civil rights advocates, and the librarians who had testified on Jalen's behalf. Side-by-side images showed the real thief in the red cap next to Jalen's school photo, proof of how far the justice system had contorted itself to protect the powerful and punish the innocent. The second article dug into Weller's court records, hundreds of them, highlighting cases where Black and Latino youth received double, even triple the sentencing of white counterparts for identical charges. By the time the third article hit, the internet was on fire. Weller exposed justice. For Jalen, how many more social media exploded? TikToks were made, memes circulated, protest groups mobilized. Activists started flooding the steps of the county courthouse, chanting Jalen's name alongside others who'd been silenced by a biased bench. And it didn't stop there. Other victims began speaking out, one by one, anonymous emails, handwritten letters, tear-filled Zoom calls, parents, siblings, children now grown. "I was sentenced to 18 months for shoplifting a phone case. My brother got 5 years for possession. His white friend walked free. My son died in lockup. Weller said he needed to learn respect." Each voice was another Domi. Each name a blow to the gavel that had once ruled without question. Judge Weller could no longer hide behind the bench. 2 weeks later, a breaking news alert interrupted daytime television across the country. Judge Douglas Weller suspended from duty, pending full investigation. The footage showed the courthouse steps as reporters swarmed, demanding statements. A lone bailiff stood guard as officials cleared Weller's chambers. Inside, Isabella watched the broadcast from her apartment, heart pounding. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Her name was trending on Twitter. People were calling her the judge's daughter who broke the system. But this wasn't victory. It was just the beginning. That night, she met Melanie Carter in person for the first time. They sat together at a quiet diner, tucked in the corner, away from the cameras. Melanie looked older than she had in the interviews, tired, haunted, but her eyes still burned. "You did it," Melanie said quietly. "You took him down." "No," Isabella said, shaking her head. "We made the truth impossible to ignore." There was a pause between them, thick with unspoken grief and shared fury. Melanie finally asked, "Do you think they'll actually overturn the cases?" Isabella looked out the window, watching a group of protesters marching by, holding signs with names that spanned 2 decades. "I think they're scared now," she said, "and scared people move." Over the next few days, more articles followed. News outlets from every coast picked up the story. National networks requested interviews. Political analysts debated live on air. Legal scholars called for deeper reform. Then came the real breakthrough. The State Department of Justice announced a formal review of every sentence handed down by Judge Weller over the past 15 years. Over 400 cases. A special task force was appointed to oversee it. Their goal: identify bias, misconduct, and wrongful convictions, and make it right. Melanie received a letter the next morning. Official seal. Her hands trembled as she tore it open. It was from the state attorney's office. The final line read, "In light of newly surfaced evidence and investigative findings, the case of Jalen Carter will be reopened for immediate judicial review." She sank to her knees, sobbing, not with sorrow this time, but with something dangerously close to hope. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Weller sat alone in his house. No cameras, no bailiffs, no robes. Just silence. His once polished reputation lay in tatters. Headlines branded him a symbol of everything broken in the system. The state bar had launched an ethics inquiry. Protesters gathered outside his gate each day. His wife had left to stay with family. His phone rang constantly, but no one offered comfort. Just questions, subpoenas, and consequences. He stared at the television as the 5th installment of the Ledger series aired. On the screen was a young man, Marcus Rivera, sentenced to 4 years for a first offense of graffiti. The white teen he was arrested with had received probation. The split screen showed Weller's sentencing transcript. Cold, condescending, racially coded. The shame came in waves, but still, he hadn't apologized. Not publicly, not to Jalen, not to his daughter, not to anyone. In the final week of coverage, the New York Ledger published a special editorial titled, "What One Daughter's Courage Exposed and What We Must Do Next." It praised Isabella's integrity, highlighted Melanie's unwavering fight, and called on lawmakers to establish mandatory racial bias training for judges, plus independent review boards to monitor sentencing disparities. Public pressure mounted. Petitions soared past 1 million signatures. And at the center of it all stood 2 women, one whose son was nearly buried by a broken system, and one who had helped build it without even knowing. Their alliance became the fire the courts could no longer smother. And as the justice system, long shrouded in silence, began to tremble under the weight of truth, one thing became crystal clear. This wasn't just about Weller anymore. This was about every courtroom, every biased gavel, every name lost in paperwork. And now those names were being spoken aloud, one by one, louder than ever. The sky above the juvenile detention center was a pale gray, overcast and heavy, as if the heavens themselves held their breath. Outside the rusted gate, a crowd had gathered. Cameras clicked. Reporters whispered into microphones. Protesters waved handmade signs. "Justice for Jalen! Free the innocent! The system must change!" A tension crackled in the air like a storm waiting to break. Then the steel doors creaked open, and Jalen Carter stepped into the light. He moved slowly, unsure, almost as if he expected someone to yank him back at the last second. His shoulders were thinner, his eyes darker, carrying the weight of everything he'd endured. The gray detention uniform hung loose on his frame. He had outgrown it emotionally, spiritually, even physically. His hands were clenched, not from fear, but from the need to stay grounded, to remind himself this was real. For a moment, no one spoke. Then someone shouted his name. "Jalen!" The crowd erupted. Cheers broke the silence like thunder. Applause followed like rolling waves. Reporters surged forward. Cameras flashed. Microphones reached for his face. But Jalen didn't react. His eyes were locked on only one person, Melanie Carter. She stood at the edge of the parking lot, barely breathing, hands covering her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes as she watched her son walk toward her, slowly, carefully, like a man emerging from fire. He stopped just 3 steps away. Neither spoke. Then Melanie dropped her purse, ran to him, and wrapped her arms around his trembling body. She clung to him as if afraid he might vanish again. Jalen pressed his face into her shoulder, breathing in the smell of home. detergent and perfume, coffee and safety. His voice cracked. "I'm sorry, Mom." "No, baby," she whispered through tears, pulling back to touch his face. "I'm sorry. I should have never let them take you from me." The cameras caught it all, the raw emotion, the reunion that should have never had to happen, the mother and son who had been separated by injustice and reunited by truth. A reporter approached cautiously. "Jalen, do you have anything to say to the public?" Jalen turned, his face calm but his voice trembling with emotion. "I just want to go home." And that was all. Melanie led him through the crowd, shielding him like a lioness guarding her cub. She didn't care about the questions or the noise. She didn't care about the headlines. She had her son back. That was the only victory that mattered. That night, the Carter home came alive again. Jalen stood in his room, fingers brushing across familiar trophies, books, the crumpled high school hoodie he hadn't seen in months. Everything looked the same, but he had changed. The boy who once dreamed of college and community service had been swallowed by the justice system and spit out harder, sharper, forged in fire. He sat on the bed, head in his hands, when a soft knock came at the door. Melanie opened it just a little, peeking in. "There's someone here to see you." Jalen looked up, wary. A moment later, Isabella Weller stepped into the room. She looked smaller than she had on television, her suit replaced by a simple jacket, her hair pulled back. Her eyes were tired but steady, and her hands clutched a folder like a shield. Jalen stood, silent, unmoving. "Hi," she said softly. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say this face to face." Melanie stood in the doorway, watching with the careful eye of a mother who had learned not to trust too easily. Isabella took a step forward. "My father did this to you, and I didn't know. I should have, but I didn't. When I found out, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't breathe. I knew I had to speak up, even if it meant destroying my family." She held out the folder. "I documented every case he ever ruled on. I made sure the review board saw it. You weren't just a mistake. You were part of a pattern. And now, that pattern is broken." Jalen took the folder but didn't look at it. He stared at her for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "I thought I'd die in there." Isabella swallowed hard. "I know. They made me feel like nothing, like my life didn't matter." "It does," she said, "more than ever." There was silence. Then Jalen extended a hand. She shook it. No forgiveness was spoken, but something shifted. A bridge built not from peace, but from understanding. 3 days later, the Carter phone rang again. This time, it was the National Legal Justice Initiative. A woman named Diane Mercer introduced herself, her voice clear and confident. "We followed Jalen's case from the beginning. It has ignited a national conversation about systemic bias. We'd like to invite Jalen to become an ambassador for our youth justice program." Melanie raised an eyebrow. "An ambassador?" "He'd speak at schools, advocacy groups, maybe even Congress. Share his story, help change the system from the inside." Melanie looked at Jalen, who had been listening nearby. He didn't react, just stared out the window, lost in thought. "Can I think about it?" he asked. "Of course," Diane replied, "but we think your voice could change lives." After the call ended, Melanie sat beside her son. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready." Jalen nodded slowly. "I'm not sure if I am." She took his hand. "But if you are," she said, "you won't be doing it alone." That night, Jalen sat at his desk with a blank sheet of paper in front of him. He picked up a pen, wrote the words, "I was 17 when the system tried to erase me, but I'm still here." The beginning of something new, not revenge, redemption, and maybe, just maybe, revolution. 5 years had passed since Jalen Carter stepped out of the juvenile detention center, the cameras flashing in his face, the cheers of protesters ringing in his ears, his mother's arms wrapped around him like a shield against the world. But time hadn't dulled the memory, it had sharpened it. Every second of his wrongful imprisonment was etched into him like a scar. It didn't fade, it fueled him. Now at 22, Jalen walked the polished halls of Colton State Law School, head held high, casebooks under one arm, his voice known across campus not just as a student, but as a survivor, a leader, and an architect of change. His past was no longer a burden, it was his weapon. The lecture halls knew his name. So did Washington. Because Jalen hadn't just survived the system, he had decided to dismantle it brick by brick from the inside out. And he wasn't doing it alone. Across the city in a sunlit office overlooking the courthouse that once tried to bury him, the doors to Justice Horizon swung open. Inside, desks buzzed with activity. Interns, paralegals, law students, and policy researchers filled the room. Diverse faces from every background, all drawn by the same mission: to expose injustice, defend the unheard, and rewrite the rules that protected power over people. And at the heart of it all, Jalen Carter and Isabella Weller. Once on opposite sides of a courtroom, one the victim of a corrupt system, the other the daughter of the man who symbolized it, they now stood side by side as co-founders of a movement that had swept the nation. Justice Horizon wasn't a nonprofit in name only. It was a war room. They took on wrongful convictions, racial bias in sentencing, juvenile incarceration reform, and judicial accountability. They trained young lawyers not just in the law, but in the courage to challenge it. Jalen's office was simple but symbolic. A framed photo of him and Melanie sat on the desk. The wall behind bore the original newspaper clipping, "Judge suspended after daughter exposes racial bias." Next to it, a second frame held a quote in bold block letters: "The system isn't broken. It was built this way. We're here to build something new." He sat at the desk that afternoon, reviewing a case involving a 15-year-old sentenced as an adult. The same nightmare. Different name. He circled passages in red, highlighting the same racial disparities he once lived. Just then, Isabella knocked once and stepped in. She looked different now, older, sharper, with the same fire in her eyes that had led her to betray the silence of her family name. "Congressional Subcommittee confirmed," she said, holding up her phone. "You're testifying next month." Jalen blinked, surprised. "That fast?" "You're too loud to ignore," she said, smirking. "Even Capitol Hill's paying attention." He stood, walked over to the window. Outside, the skyline shimmered in the early spring sun. He remembered pacing in a 6x8 cell, wondering if he'd ever see sunlight through a window without bars. "I'm ready," he said. Isabella studied him for a moment. "You're not the same kid they locked up." Jalen nodded. "But they taught me exactly what to fight." The door burst open then, an intern waving a folder. "We've got another one," she said breathlessly. 14-year-old, same county, sentenced by a new judge. And guess what? The DA's office tried to bury the video footage. Jalen's face hardened. "Get their name. We'll take it." They weren't just fixing old cases anymore. They were stopping new ones from ever happening. Across the office, phones rang. Legal briefs flew across desks. Advocacy videos were edited. Op-eds published. Data reports finalized. Justice Horizon had grown from two people into a movement. And everywhere Jalen and Isabella went, schools, law conferences, community centers, they carried a message the system couldn't ignore anymore. Justice must be rebuilt, not rebranded. 5 years ago, they'd been two young people crushed by the weight of one man's gavel. Now they held the megaphone, and they weren't putting it down. The name Douglas Weller once struck fear, reverence, and silent obedience throughout the Oak Ridge County Courthouse. His gavel had the weight of finality, and his bench was a throne no one dared challenge. But that was years ago. Now the man once feared as an unflinching enforcer of law and order walked quietly onto a small community college stage in rural Pennsylvania, wearing no robe, no badge, and no illusion of righteousness. Gray had overtaken his hair. His posture, once proud and commanding, now sloped under the burden of years spent confronting his past. He cleared his throat and faced the modest crowd gathered for his presentation. "Bias in the courtroom, how I learned to listen too late." He didn't pretend anymore. "I was wrong," Weller began, his voice slow but steady. "For 25 years, I sat on the bench believing I was delivering justice. What I delivered instead was harm rooted in bias I never acknowledged, until it was too late." The students watched, some skeptical, some curious. He paused and looked down at his notes, but he didn't read from them. There was a boy named Jalen Carter, 17, an honor student, accused of theft. Every shred of evidence proved his innocence. I saw it, and I ignored it. Because he didn't look right to me. Because I assumed what I should have questioned. A hush fell across the room. I sentenced him to 2 years. I robbed him of his youth, his future. And when I walked out of that courtroom, I told myself I had done my job. But I hadn't done justice. I had done damage. There was no applause, no admiration, just silence. And that was how Judge Douglas Weller preferred it. Because redemption, he had learned, was not something you were owed. It was something you worked for, even if you could never fully earn it. He now spent his days speaking at schools, civic halls, even police academies, using his own failure as a case study in the urgency of judicial humility and systemic reform. He never asked for sympathy. He only asked that his mistakes be turned into momentum. Meanwhile, far from that small stage in a gleaming conference center in Washington, D.C., thousands of the nation's top legal minds, scholars, activists, and lawmakers filled the National Hall for the annual Justice Reform Summit. Cameras were everywhere. Every word spoken here would ripple across policy, politics, and public discourse. And at the center of the agenda, two names now synonymous with the fight for transformation: Jalen Carter and Isabella Weller. Their organization, Justice Horizon, had grown beyond its founders. Chapters now operated in 26 states. Their work had influenced legislation in 5. But this was something bigger, a moment 5 years in the making. The announcer's voice echoed through the auditorium. Please welcome co-founders of Justice Horizon, advocates and survivors of systemic injustice, Jalen Carter and Isabella Weller. Thunderous applause. Jalen stepped up first, wearing a tailored Navy suit, his stance grounded, calm, commanding. But his eyes held the fire of someone who had been to hell and clawed his way back with truth in both hands. He scanned the room. I was 17 when the justice system decided I didn't matter, he began. They had the footage, the witnesses, the truth. But it wasn't enough, because truth wasn't what they were trained to see. They saw my skin first, and everything else last. The room was silent now, focused. I sat in a concrete cell for a crime I didn't commit while the real thief walked free, because his father had power and I had none. My mother fought like hell to save me, and when she got too close to the truth, they locked me in solitary. He paused, letting the tension hang like a storm cloud. 5 years later, I stand here not just as a law student, not just as a survivor, but as someone determined to make sure no child ever has to endure what I did. Applause roared again. Then Jalen turned toward Isabella, who now stood beside him at the podium, the daughter of the judge who had once destroyed his life, now his partner in rebuilding the world that nearly broke them both. Isabella stepped forward. When I discovered the truth about my father's courtroom, she said, voice clear and fierce, I had 2 choices: protect his legacy or protect the lives his rulings destroyed. She looked out over the crowd, her gaze unwavering. I chose the truth, and it cost me my family, my home, everything familiar. But it gave me something more important, a cause worth burning for. Behind them, a massive screen lit up, showing the title of their joint policy proposal: Justice Accountability, Sentencing Parity, and Equity Reform. Isabella continued, pointing to the screen. We're here to propose national-level reform that ensures no judge, no courtroom, and no case ever gets buried under bias again. Jalen took over. The Jasper Act includes 5 pillars, he explained. Mandatory racial bias training for all judges, real-time sentence disparity tracking by independent oversight bodies, public access to judicial statistics, federal oversight of juvenile sentencing practices, and a whistleblower protection clause for court staff and attorneys who expose discrimination. Applause again, louder this time. Justice can't depend on who your father is, Isabella added. It can't hinge on the zip code you're born into, the color of your skin, or the school you attend. It must be blind, but also aware. They concluded together. We don't want to reform the system just to make it more palatable. We want to rebuild it, to finally make it just. The entire hall rose to their feet, thunderous, prolonged standing ovation. As they stepped down from the stage, dozens rushed to greet them, lawmakers, journalists, students who had followed their journey from the very beginning. But just as the wave of congratulations swelled around them, a quiet figure approached from the side of the room. Douglas Weller. No camera followed him. No microphone caught his breath. He walked slowly, hands trembling slightly, until he stood in front of Jalen and Isabella. Jalen turned. They locked eyes. No hatred, just weight. "I watched your speech," Weller said softly, "and I want you to know. I hear you now. I didn't before, but I do now." Jalen didn't speak. Not yet. Isabella looked at her father, aged, unarmed, no longer a symbol of authority, but a man who had been shattered by his own silence. Then Jalen extended his hand, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement, a gesture that said, "You can't undo what you've done, but you can help make sure it never happens again." Weller shook it, and then quietly slipped away, lost in the crowd, but no longer hiding. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.